Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to finish our presentation on articulatory phonetics. Now remember, linguistics is the scientific study of language. Phonetics, within linguistics, is the part that relates to sounds and pronunciation. And articulatory phonetics specifically looks at how physically we make the sounds of a language. A knowledge of this field can help language teachers to show students how to make the unfamiliar sounds of a new language. So let's review some of what we did last time. Last time we focused on vowels, and this week we'll talk about consonants. But let's review some of what we did before. We started by naming the relevant body parts. I have a chart here with the parts labeled, but let's look first at the picture of Peter Latifoga, my old phonetics professor. And this sort of shows how this chart relates to an actual human head. So this is called the vocal tract. And it has these basic parts. Let's look at the chart part now. We have the two lips, the teeth right behind that. Right behind that, the alveolar ridge, that's that bump. It's kind of in the front of the roof of your mouth. Behind that, the hard palate. We're looking at the roof of the mouth now. The hard palate. Behind that, the soft palate. And the soft palate ends in the soft palate or velum ends in this little part that hangs down, which is called the uvula. This part of the back of the throat is the pharynx. This is the epiglottis. We don't need to talk about those right now. This whole thing here is the tongue, and the movement of the tongue to form different shapes and to touch different parts of this vocal tract is going to be very critical in making both vowels and consonants. Of course, at the bottom here off the chart, we have your voice box or larynx way down at the bottom, and within that larynx are your vocal cords, technically called vocal folds, which are two little flaps which vibrate together and start the noise, which is then going to be shaped as it passes out through this vocal tract. Let's sit down again for a minute, and I'll review quickly some of the things we demonstrated last time. I'll just do it a little more briefly this time. So what we're trying to figure out is how the vocal tract can be manipulated to make the various different vowels and consonants of a language. We demonstrated that basically the sound that comes out of your mouth when you're speaking is shaped according to the resonating cavity. And to demonstrate some of the basics of this, let me do my balloon demo very briefly here. If I blow up a balloon, this is sort of analogous to your lungs. They have air trapped in them under pressure, and at the top will be your vocal folds up here in your larynx. And as this air is released through your larynx, it's going to make those vocal folds vibrate, something like this. That's just a simple kind of squeaky, creaky noise. That's basically the sound that's being made down here in your throat by your vocal folds. As that sound comes out, though, it's going to be shaped according to what you've done within your vocal tract, where your tongue is and your teeth and your lips. To illustrate that just a little bit, listen to this. That wah wah is because I'm changing my mouth from more of a U or a W shape to an ah wah wah. So whatever the source of the sound, it's going to make that resonating air within your vocal cavity produce certain acoustic results depending on the particular shape you've given to it. Let me let this out now. Another thing we demonstrated is that the size of the cavity makes a difference. So here I have a bottle with this much of a resonating air cavity, and it sounds like that. Here I have one with this much larger resonating air cavity, and it sounds like this. Whoops, sorry. There we go. A much deeper sound. So a larger cavity makes a deeper sound. And that's partly the reason why men or larger people in general tend to have deeper voices than women. Also has to do with the mass within your actual vocal folds, that you have more massive things vibrating here. But your whole vocal tract is larger, so it tends to produce a deeper sound. So let's see. Now, so what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the parts of this vocal tract that move, the tongue and the lips and so forth, to produce different shapes and sizes of resonating cavity. And the result will be what we perceive and process mentally as various vowels or consonants of our language or of a language that we're learning. Let me show just briefly this thing. The technical name, if we can get a shot of that. The technical name for this thing, which is sort of sound tracings made in a laboratory, acoustic tracings of an actual sentence, this is showing the actual acoustic result. What we're mainly talking about tonight is how we achieve that result, but this is a representation of the result. This is a tracing of the sentence, he left there 3 days ago. And the main part I wanted to show is the vowels. Here's the E. These 1, 2, 3, 4 main harmonics here represent the vowel E, the sound E, although we spell it with, well, never mind how we spell it, but the sound E as in he, and here's the E of left, E, E. You can see they have a different combination of acoustic properties. There, he left there. Here's the E going down to an R, which is kind of vowel-like sound. 3, here's the E of 3, very similar to the E of he. Days, here's an A. Go, the O on the end has a kind of sliding diphthongal quality to it. So people study acoustic phonetics as well. We won't say any more about that, except that the purpose of manipulating your vocal tract is to achieve that acoustic result, all of which we do, of course, totally unconsciously, as if it were magic, because our brains are such that it allows us to do this, and speech works. All right, let's look. We already talked about vowels, but let me just put this chart up. Let me just hold that. Let's see, maybe I better stand next to this one. Just a moment. This will show, this shows all in one chart, sort of the general array of the position of your vocal, your speech organs, so to speak, as you make the different vowels. The different numbering of these positions, mainly positions of the tongue, represents different vowels. So number 1 is the E of heed, or he, as we saw on our sonogram a minute ago. So when you make the vowel E, your tongue, let me trace this to make it very clear, your lips are in about this position, and your tongue is high up in your mouth, almost touching the roof of your mouth, and then it comes down like this at the back. So that blue line represents the tongue position within this vocal tract for the vowel E, as in heed. And then the second position, 2, is the vowel E, as in head. And then we have, I'll go through them in order. 3 is head, 4 is had. Had is the tongue is very low in your mouth. Father, or hod, if you know that word, even lower in your mouth. And so forth. And then at the back, there are so-called back vowels, have the tongue sort of humping up towards the back of the mouth. So in the back we can go good or food. And those are the various different positions for different vowels. And we talked about that last time. So I think I'll just do that brief presentation for now so that we can concentrate more on consonants this week. The same sort of thing happens with consonants, and we could put on overlays and show all where the different apparatuses are. But let me just look at it in terms of these parts of the vocal tract, and I'll give you some examples of each one. I think you'll get the idea. Okay, first of all, we have what are called fricative consonants. Let me start with those. Those are some of the easiest ones to think about in terms of a feature called voicing, which we need to talk about. So a good example of a fricative consonant would be, say, an F. An F is considered, if you sit and make an F for a minute, say a word like fun or feel, you have to sort of make yourself conscious of this. We're not used to being conscious of what we're doing. But that very first sound starts by putting your upper teeth, poking them into your lower lip. So these upper teeth touch the lower lip, and yet we don't close off the flow of air completely. We don't go, we go, the air is coming out continuously, but with your teeth touching your lips. So there's this friction-y sound, and that's why these sounds are called fricatives, because they're sort of hissy or friction-y sounds. You hear a lot of turbulence as the airstream comes out, but it's not coming out unobstructed, so it creates some noise there. And there's a characteristic noise and a sonogram that would go with words beginning with a f sound that would differ from, say, words beginning with a s sound made. In English, we usually make our s somewhere around the alveolar ridge, with your tongue tip up around the alveolar ridge. But again, you leave enough space so the sound can keep coming out, but it becomes turbulent because the organs are very close together, and there's kind of friction and turbulence caused. So we can make a f, a s, an h, With an H sound, we really don't have anything constricted here. It's basically just sort of the sound, the unvoiced sound of air coming out through an open vocal tract. There are other languages which have other fricative consonants in between, like up here around the velar area, in the soft palate or velum. If you bring your tongue up to here and make a fricative sound, you get a sound like ch, ch, written with X in some languages. This is well known in German, where you say ach, for instance. It also occurs in Ponca and in Cheyenne and in a number of languages. An English ear thinks of it as an H-like sound, but more spitty or noisy, and that's because of this constriction at the back of the roof of your mouth, at your velar area. So that's called a velar fricative, and it's often written with an X by phoneticians. And in some Indian and European languages, it's written with an X. But what I meant when I was talking about voicing, let's go back to the vocal folds. Remember the balloon? There were two little bits of rubber here that were vibrating together when I let the air escape through it. Similarly, in our larynx, we have two little bits of muscle. Really, your vocal folds are bits of muscle, and they're hinged in such a way that we can make them open wide for a sound like H, just comes out freely, or we can close them down closer so that they're close together, like the throat on that balloon, and there's some vibration as the air comes through. When that happens, we get a buzzy sound like a I'm actually making a vowel when I say but all of our voiced sounds involve vibration of the vocal folds way down in here, and then that creates a kind of noise which is shaped as it goes through the mouth. But to show you the difference between voiced sounds and unvoiced sounds, let's go back to a sound like the F that we started with, labio-dental fricative. So we put these parts together, but the sound keeps coming out, so we get a f. There's another sound made with the same teeth and the same lip in the same position, but with the vocal folds vibrating, and that's called a V. We usually write it with a V, and that sounds like V. So if you think, let's just say a nonsense syllable, we can say fee, or we can, I guess these are words in English, fee, you pay a fee, or let's write the letter V, fee versus V. If you want to teach yourself about voicing, put your hands right on your Adam's apple here. You'll feel as you talk, that place that vibrates is your, loosely called the Adam's apple. The technical term is the larynx, and your vocal folds are inside of there. They're either vibrating or not. Now, if you just place your fingers here and say, as in fee, you'll feel no vibration during that F. But when you say v, as in V, you'll feel a lot of vibration. That's your vocal folds vibrating. So we have voiceless, we have a voiceless labio-dental fricative, which is called F, and we have a voiced, that means the vocal cords are vibrating, a voiced labio-dental fricative, which is V. So F and V. So now we know something about what we're doing with the parts of our anatomy as we have learned to distinguish an F from a V. We're doing something with our teeth, our lips, and our vocal folds. And so we're creating an F or a V. I told you S is made somewhere behind that, around the alveolar ridge. S. If you put your fingers on your throat again and say S, like in Sue, S, you'll feel no vibration for the S. But when you say Z, that starts with a Z, you feel the vibration. So S is a voiceless alveolar fricative, and Z is a voiced alveolar fricative. And as you go through the vocal tract, you'll find different pairs, depending on which language we're talking about, different pairs at each point along the way. For instance, that X sound I mentioned, that ch, there's a Ponca word, rage, which has something like that X sound, but it's the voiced version. It's a voiced velar fricative, r. That sound doesn't occur in English, although it did in an earlier stage of English, I think. Certainly the X did. I think they both used to occur in English. That r, written with a GH in the Ponca alphabet, occurs in words like rage, to cry. So we have velar fricatives, alveolar, labiodental. Some languages, like Comanche, have bilabial fricatives. That would be when you put your two lips together. Your upper and lower lips come together, but they don't close all the way, so the sound's still coming out. And they have a voiced bilabial fricative, and it sounds like V. It's written with a B, but it's not really a B. For B, you stop the flow of the air for a minute, and then release it. B. But this is more like Va. It's a continuous sound. It's a fricative, turbulent, continuous sound. V. It's written with the letter B. It's sort of, you can think of it as between a B and a V. It's continuous like English V, but it's bilabial like English B. So that's a bilabial voiced fricative. And so let me just pause for a moment because I've already thrown a bunch of technical terms at you, but let's just think, why is she going off the deep end with all these terms and anatomy and what's it all about? Well, suppose you were a Comanche teacher and you wanted to teach your students to say a word like pavi for older brother. They're going to probably, if they're English students, and especially if they're seeing a written version of it, written P-A-B-I, they're going to tend to say pa-bi. Or then somebody's going to say, oh no, it's not like it's more like a V. Commonly people that are not trained in this sort of approach will say, well, it's more like a V, so then they'll say pa-vi. And you hear a lot of people pronounce Comanche that way. And in fact, the authentic sound is neither a V or a B. It's not labiodental, it's bilabial, but it's a fricative, continuous sound, so it's pa-vi, V. And that's a hard sound for an English speaker to get used to making. But if you give them a few simple lessons and get them conscious of what they're doing with their lips to make a V and a B, then they'll realize that they do the lip position for the letter B, like in English boy, but they do the process, the fricative action, voiced fricative action, like the letter V in English. And when you kind of get them more conscious of how they manipulate the parts of their vocal tract to make a given sound, and tell them, of course, to keep listening to tapes, listening to speakers, and try to imitate what they're doing. But remember, it's two lips, it's not your teeth in your lips. When you give them these extra little hints about what to do with their anatomy, it tends to help them be more successful in duplicating the sound. So it's important to know what you're doing with the parts of your anatomy if you want to make a sound, especially a sound that's not familiar to you already from your language. And it'll help you to not confuse an unfamiliar sound with, say, the B and V of English, which you are familiar with. So that's why I think this is useful. So far we've talked about fricatives, voiced and voiceless fricatives. There are many other types of consonant sounds as well. Let's look briefly at some stop consonants. They're called stop because at some point along this vocal tract, the whole passage is closed off for an instant and then it opens again. And you have voiceless and voiced stops. Let's start out at the lips. A voiceless, bilabial, meaning two lips involved, voiceless, bilabial stop is made right here. You bring your lips together like this. And then you open them like, say, in the English word pot, pa, or paw, like ma and pa, okay? Let's just say pa to keep it simple. Pa. If you look at yourself in the mirror while you say pa, you may not have realized this before, but you'll see very clearly you close your lips and then open them for the vowel. Close for the P, open for the vowel. So P is a bilabial but voiceless stop. It's made with the two lips and without the vocal folds vibrating. And then as you open up into that ah vowel sound, almost all vowels in languages are voiced, so your vocal cords start to vibrate very quickly after the P. But let's take a minimal pair sound that differs only by the consonant before the vowel. Like, let's say pun. You can tell a joke which is a pun. That starts with a P, voiceless. Pun. If I did it in slow motion, it would be pun. Okay, the P part is voiceless. But we have another word that's a minimal pair with this that has only the one difference that your vocal folds are vibrating. It's made with a bilabial voiced stop, B. So you can say bun. And the reason we can distinguish pun from bun in English is because we know when to turn on our vocal folds and when to turn them off. Because the same two lips are doing the same thing. The only thing that's different is down in the vocal folds. So we can distinguish a voiceless stop consonant from a voiced stop consonant. So we have P and B made at the lips. Going back a little bit in the mouth, remember we had S and Z sounds a little bit farther back on the alveolar ridge. For stop consonants in that area in English, we have T and D. So we can say tin versus din. In each case, the tongue comes up to the alveolar ridge, closes off the whole vocal tract for a second, and then opens. So you say tin, or din if you vibrate your vocal folds earlier in the process. Tin versus din. Some languages have a consonant up in here. This is used, I think, marginally in German with sort of like k. Sounds like a K, but it's made more in the middle of the mouth. Going farther back here, we're all familiar with the K-type sounds of English and of many languages. That's a velar stop. A voiceless velar stop is what we think of as a K. So you can say cane. That starts with k. If you say k, k, k many times, you can make yourself conscious of what you're doing, you can feel that your tongue is touching somewhere around your velum, the back soft part of your palate. And then it releases as you open up your vocal tract to make that vowel. So cane versus it has a voiced counterpart, a voiced velar stop, which is g. So you can say cane and gain. They mean two different things. So as English speakers and listeners, we need to be able to manipulate and recognize those differences. When do you vibrate your vocal folds while bringing your tongue to your velum? And when do you not? That will distinguish cane from gain. It's extremely complicated what we do when we speak. Of course, we do it very unconsciously unless you're a linguistics student. You don't even know what you're doing. And yet, obviously, on some level within our brain, we know what we're doing. We're monitoring and controlling and managing the situation so that we say what we intend to say. It's absolutely amazing, I think. And that's another reason why I always like to say the brain is the primary organ of speech, because that's the thing that's coordinating all of these motions, making the vocal folds start, stop, lips, close, open, tongue, go back or forward for an ooh or an eh. All of this is a very complex management job that our brains basically are doing by giving instructions to these various parts of our vocal tract. Okay, so we went some stops from p, b, t, d, k, and g. And there's another stop which I got to mention because it figures in many Oklahoma Indian languages, and it's made down here off the chart in the larynx by the vocal folds. Vocal cords, as they're often called, but vocal folds is more of a technical term. Remember I said those vocal folds are two little lengths of muscle. They can be open, as when we say huh or any of the voiceless sounds, s, they're just open. But then when you close that hinge down and make them closer to each other so they vibrate like the throat of that balloon, then you can make vowel sounds, ah, e, or you can make z and v and b and so forth. So you have voiced and voiceless sounds. But so far we were talking about vowels and fricative consonants, but we also have a stop consonant that can be made down there at your glottis. And what you do is you have those vocal folds in here, and they close down completely for an instant, and then open up to make the following vowel. So an example of this would be, we use it marginally in English, although it's not really an essential sound of our language. We don't have a letter for it. But when we say something like uh-oh, there's a vowel followed by a glottal stop. If you say uh-oh many times, and especially if you put your fingers here, I think you'll become conscious of when that happens, when that closure or stoppage happens. You go close, oh, open again, close, open, uh-oh. If it weren't there, we would be saying oh, all smooth, just going from one vowel to the other. But there's actually a stoppage of the airstream for an instant between the and the o, and we say uh-oh. In Caddo, we say ahayu. At the beginning of many prayers, you'll hear the phrase ahayu, which is Father above. Means Father. That's an ah vowel, followed by another ah vowel, with a glottal stop in between. And there's a letter. We use a glottal stop, a particular letter, to represent that glottal stop in Caddo. It also figures in Ponca and Comanche and many languages of the world. Just doesn't happen to be an essential sound of English. So it throws people when they're first learning it. But sometimes if you tell them how to make it, it'll help. It's usually best, I find, just to give an example like uh-oh. Or tell somebody, you know, when you want to be emphatic, you're saying the only thing, but you want to say the only thing. That's when you're making your glottal stop. And people eventually, by listening and trying many times, will catch on. But that's a stop consonant made down here. And it's not voiced because you can't be vibrating your vocal folds and closing them at the same time, so it's considered a voiceless glottal stop. That's where that fancy term glottal stop comes from. Now, we've only got a few minutes left. Let me see, I might want to skip around a little bit. We've talked about stop consonants like p, b, t, d, k, g, glottal stop. Fricatives like f, v, s, z. H, by the way, is actually considered a fricative consonant, but it's considered a glottal fricative. The air is flowing through the glottis, and there's no other constriction up here. No languages in this state have the voiced glottal fricative. I don't believe Arabic is famous for a h sound. Let's look at some other things. Let's look at Y and W for just a second. Those are usually called glide consonants. And if you remember before, I was showing the position for, well, I've messed up my overlay now, but, well, briefly, the position for the vowels E and U, that's related to the glides Y and W because that E, as in he, that's the number one line here. Your tongue is towards the front of your mouth in that kind of a shape. all bunched towards the front, fairly close to the roof of your mouth. That's how you make an E sound. That's almost exactly how you make a Y sound, a Y. So if you wanted to say, for instance, the sequence E-ah, let me just write this so you can keep track of what's going on a little bit here. If you want to say the vowel, I'm using a phonetic version of how we're going to spell E and ah, because that's what I'm used to. Here's the vowel E, here's the vowel ah. If you simply say those two vowels together, E-ah, sounds like two vowels. But if you make this part sort of shorter, and maybe your tongue a little bit closer to the roof of your mouth, and say it very quickly, ya, 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 pretty soon you're saying ya, you're saying this. So Y is sort of a consonantal version of the vowel E. And likewise, you can say ooh, ah. And remember, U is made with the tongue way back in the back of the mouth, ooh as in who. So is W. If you make a sound very much like U, but more consonantal, a little closer, a little quicker, you go ooh, ah, that's two vowels. But ooh, ah, wah, 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 wah. Pretty soon you're going wah, W-A, which you might want to write with a W. And Y and W are considered consonants, but in particular they're called glide consonants. Or sometimes they're called semi-vowels because they're very vowel-like, but they actually do behave as consonants. But in many languages, there'll be a particular relationship in the grammar between E and Y or oo and W. And finally, I've only got a minute left. Let me just say a little bit about liquids. There's another category of consonants called liquids, and this basically covers the L-like sounds and the R-like sounds, which are also a little bit vocalic. They're not as consonant-y as the stops and fricatives. So in English we have actually two kinds of L. We spell them the same, but we have a more front L and then a farther back O, which we tend to use at the end of a word. Leaf versus feel. Those are actually two different L's. In Creek, those are both voiced sounds, though in English. In Creek we have a voiceless L that sounds sort of like F, as in flop loco, tribal town. And the other type of liquid sound would be R's. There is no R in Cherokee. English has a very vocalic, sort of bunched up R. Many languages have more of a flapped R, as in Comanche, nice. It's not it's so we're out of time. I got to quit. But I hope this gives you some idea of the incredible richness of the choices we have when we do things with our vocal organs to produce the various sounds of speech. And the complete inventory of sounds will depend on which language you're speaking. A little knowledge of how you do this might help you get better at speaking a language that's your second language. Got to wrap it up. So I'll see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene.